this panel, which is Feminist Epistemologies and the Repositioning of Praxis. My name is Kharnita Mohamed, and I'll be chairing the session. And how we're going to, sorry, we've just run back and forth. And how we're going to organize the panel is each of the panelists will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions afterwards. Our first speaker is Dr. Maria Martin. She is at New History and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Merced, and her talk is Legbism, Non-Political Nationalism, Cosmology, and Inductive Theoretical Development in Nigerian Women's Intellectual History. Welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to thank you all for being here and welcome you to this presentation. I'm appreciative of being in this space and of all of the ideas and the energy that's being cultivated here today. I thank you for being in this space and creating this experience with me. So my talk is going to center theoretical development, really, in seeing or viewing Africa as a site of theoretical development in our research. So I'm, a historian. My background is actually in Black Studies. So I'm a PhD of Black Studies, African American and African Studies. And I concentrate in history and also women and gender studies within that field. So I think a lot, now about my research on Africa and African women and developing a theory of gender based on that research, because there's many different iterations of African feminism, and there's also some that don't fall under there's some iterations of women's activism that don't fall under the banner of feminism for some researchers who are using different gender theories. So I'm thinking about all of this, and I wanted to present this idea of viewing Africa as a center of theoretical development instead of only a place of empirical data collection. So that's what this is going to center on today. So I'm going to cover these three things: the necessity, the support for, and an example of viewing Africa as a site of theoretical development. So this is obviously going to deal with gender as well, because my research is, I should tell you that my research is on Nigerian women's intellectual history. So in terms of intellectual history, we have a lot to do in developing women's intellectual history, especially in Africa, in African context. So that's really what my research entails. It hinges on this idea that Nigerian women created during the era of nationalism or anti-colonialism, when they developed this idea of non-political nationalism. And nationalism is always something that's seen as very highly political, but they have articulated this idea of non-political nationalism for very distinctive reasons. But that's not what this presentation is going to be about. This is going to be about how I theorize about the reasons and the rationale behind their articulation of non-political nationalism. So first, I have a question for all of you. So we're going to create this experience together. So hopefully this works. I haven't tried it here before. I have tried it in another African context and it didn't work. Okay, well maybe, let's see. I know I've logged in.
Is that the question of the have you ever used Western? Is that the one?
Yeah, that's the one.
So if you click on that, it may
Yeah, it didn't. It's a poll and it's not coming up. So, let's see. I think. I don't know if it's gonna come up. Okay, maybe this. No, it's still doing the same thing. Well, however, the question was, have you ever used Western theories to situate or to analyze your research on Africa or African women? So I guess we could just do a show of hands. So you've used Western theories to analyze your data or to explain the phenomenon in your data that you've collected in the continent, whether it's gender or women's studies or not. So that's, quite a bit of hands in the room. So I want to ask you if anybody wants to share, why is it that you chose Western theories? Yeah.
So I don't know if you would call him Western, but I'm talking about Legbism, who was Russian and did a lot of work on children's play and the idea that private speech that children produce when they play is an important step in their cognitive development. And we've all seen children talking to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And he believed that was a universal, wherever culture you come from. So I was working with groups of students who tried to collect data in which they had to play with things, blocks, and the kind of private speech they produced.
Mm.
So the notion that private speech is universal was a Vygotsky notion.
Okay.
But Vygotsky is not a European or an American theorist. He was
Mhm.
Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And his work was banished by Stalin, and he had a very repressive intellectual history because of it.
Okay. Okay. Thank you.
And we did find private speech by African children.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did an indigenous research, but at the same time, I was going to categorize the different forms of masculinity in our community. Now, I couldn't find an African scholar that was able to come up with 4 kinds of masculinity that I was going to talk about in my research. So I found Riwan Cornell, who is a female Australian anthropologist. And she was able to categorize the different forms of masculinity that I wanted to talk about. I didn't just want to talk about hegemonic masculinity. I wanted to talk about 4 different kinds of masculinity that describes the African man. In as much as I wanted to do an indigenous research, we needed a theory, and that woman's theory, was helpful to describe what I wanted to do.
Okay. So I hear what you're saying, and so you're saying because they apply,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
Because they're applicable. Okay. Yeah, and that's obviously why that's one reason why we've been using Western theories to interpret our data here that we collect here in the continent. But I think that this also is indicative of a situation that's telling us that we need to have more theoretical development in the continent so that we have those theories. So if you all are using, and this is something that I'll talk about in a minute, but if you all are using these theories and you're recognizing that it's difficult to find African-centered theories that do the same thing, then why not create them yourselves? That's my question. So while we're thinking about this question of why, why do we use these other theories? So one thing that for me within gender studies is important is expanding the theories of gender that we use, especially with regard to the continent. So one thing that we've already propounded is that African-centered theories need to be expanded upon, but those theories in regards to gender also need to be expanded. So I want to talk a little bit about that first element of this talk, which is that necessity of centering Africa in theoretical development. These are my students from Nigeria. I taught for 10 months on a Fulbright at the University of Ibadan Gender Studies program. It was a very edifying experience. And during the gender methods course, one of the students asked me, why is it that we're always using feminism? And they were frustrated about it. And they were like, what other theories can we use? So, I introduced them to other theories that they could use. But then when they tried those theories, they were like, well, we're still a little frustrated because this also doesn't really suffice to describe the phenomenon and help us to explain the phenomenon that we're experiencing in our data. So what I had them to do was start to think about how they could develop theories themselves and how they could view Africa as a site of theoretical development instead of searching for theories all around outside of the continent. So what we did in my class, I like to challenge Eurocentric paradigms of knowledge production, and so I use hip-hop pedagogy when I teach. And that means that I use the cultural principles or the principles of hip-hop culture to embody our learning practices. So we kind of use it as an embodied practice in the classroom. So for example, instead of just doing debates, we battle rap, to debate things, or instead of only synthesizing and expressing, we'll do graffiti walls to express what we've learned from readings and things like that. So in this class, in this context, I had them use hip-hop culture in Nigeria, and they analyzed a song from Davido and Wizkid. And I told them I wanted them to create a theory of womanhood and manhood as expressed in youth popular culture. And so they did that by creating, obviously by using those themes of womanhood and manhood and coding their data and looking for any types of language, portrayals, euphemisms, what have you, about manhood, womanhood, making observations about what those things communicated, and then developing an explanation that was rooted in their cultural understanding in their context. And so in that way, they developed theories, and I asked them to name their theories as well. So they created theories of manhood and womanhood, or portrayals of manhood and womanhood in Nigerian youth popular culture in that way. So when we did this, we found that there's active and passive ways of engaging Africa theoretically. So the active way would be viewing Africa as a site of theoretical development, meaning that we center Africa, the African context, intellectual thought, culture, history, etc., in our theorizing about our data. But the passive way for me of engaging Africa theoretically would be data collection using outside theories. Now, in a lot of instances, we have to do that because they're applicable and we lack the theories from inside of the African context. But we also found that it's imperative for us to start pushing these young African scholars of Africa to begin to develop these different theories that emerge from their own context. So this is a process that at its core includes making observations, asking questions about what's been observed, and then using the knowledge from that particular African context to answer those questions, thereby developing an explanation as to how or why a phenomenon took place. So just quickly, in light of the second objective of this talk, there are a lot of African gender scholars that speak to the need of developing an African-centered theory of gender. So these two women, Obioma Nameka and Oyeronke Oyewumi, they share in this idea that African women's knowledge and experiences are valid and can be properly represented and understood within the context of their own perspectives. So just in short, this is what my theorizing kind of follows, this kind of idea that African women's knowledge and experiences are valid and can only properly be represented and understood within the context of their own perspectives. So in light of the last objective for this talk, I want to give an example of theoretical development that centers the African context. And this is a theory that I've developed for my research that I did not feel some of the Western theories, but also some of the other gender theories that did emerge from the continent. I didn't feel that they really suffice to capture this phenomenon that I was seeing in my research. So I developed this theory. It's called Legbism. I'm still working on it. It's still in progress. But it's based on Yerba cosmology. And just in short, this means that I'm including a thought process that hinges off of Yoruba worldviews. So my research is centered mainly on Yoruba women in the southwest of Nigeria and their idea of non-political nationalism. So this story of Oshun in their cosmology, she's a goddess who gives life, but these other deities that were male, they came, they were sent to earth with her to, start up the earth. And the male deities ignored her and they didn't consult with her. They made a plan and then they brought it to her and told her, well, you just need to go along with this plan. But the Almighty God, Olodumare, he told them, no, you can't, because she refused to just go along with their plan. And they said, well, hey, Olodumare, she's stopping us up. And he said, well, look, you have to go and apologize to her because nothing can be done without women. And so that means that women's work, it's very important in this whole scheme of how the world is set up, or being in the world, and this Yoruba cosmology. So men and women work in a concerted effort, and one is not greater than the other. They are equal opposites, and they're both important. So that's this concept of complementary synergy, that men and women have to work together to create a stable, consistent whole. And I think that this is I take an asset-based approach to gender relations, that we're not defining men and women based on biological determinism and all those types of ideas, but based on what they give to society, what they bring to society. And so this is what I think the Yoruba culture is communicating about their worldview on gender. And so these are some of the foundational ideas that encapsulate my theory. But the tenets of my theory are relative perception, or a sense of shared responsibility that determines men's and women's actions. So because men and women have to work together and complement one another to help, build a stable society, then what one group is doing, one group chooses work relative to what the other group is doing. So if one group has done something, but they can't do everything and other things are left undone, then that other group will pick up, whatever work needs to be done. So there's a Yoruba proverb that if a man and woman are working in a garden and there's a snake in the garden, then the woman kills it, then it doesn't matter who kills the snake so long as it's dead. So they are not thinking about, men do this, men need to kill that snake. It's whoever kills it, it's okay. So there's this idea of relative perception, or a sense of shared responsibility that determines men's and women's actions. The second tenet is the cooperation and mutual respect are central to healthy gender relations. So they are complementary, like in that story of Oshun. And then lastly, the communal element, which encompasses the both and model, which means that actions are for the good of both men and women. And this inspires people's actions. So people do things for communal and not individualistic benefit. And that includes women's rights. And when I was looking at my research and looking at this idea of non-political nationalism, it's very gendered. And it obviously encapsulated women's rights and women's issues in a lot of ways because it's, developed by women. But I noticed that feminism is more woman-centered, and what they were doing was obviously centering women, but it was for a greater purpose, which was more communal. And so that's this idea of this communal element. It wasn't individualistic. It was it's related to that no ego feminism of Obioma Nameka. So these are the things that I'm thinking about and I'm developing as I'm trying to view Africa as a site of theoretical development. So I hope that you've taken something important away from this, which is that we need to continue to develop theory that comes out of the African context and not superimposing theories all the time on the African context. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria, for getting us started towards thinking not only about situated knowledge and how it moves, thinking about the pedagogies of epistemology and how we reproduce and transmit particular modes of understanding and engaging with the world, and also offering alternative spaces through which we can begin to think about how to theorize from the epicenters of our agency, which is why we're here at this moment. Thank you. Our next speaker is Dr. Dominic Grifฟี่. His talk is on decoloniality and the impossibility of an African feminist philosophy. Dominic is at the Wits School of Education. Welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. Where should I put this? If I have water with me when I speak, it's sort of a comfort. All right, so thank you all for having me. I teach philosophy of education at the Wits School of Education. My background is in philosophy, so philosophers just read their papers. which is what I'm going to do. So yeah, there won't be a presentation. I just want to get my timer. So I'm going to go over. Okay, so I think what I say resonates with what Maria has just said. So that's quite good, I think, for the kind of argument I'm trying to generate. Okay, so this paper seeks to critically interrogate Olawele's claim that an African feminist philosophy cannot develop until identifiable and African philosophical worldviews and principles that guide the relationship between men and women have been established. Her argument rests on the assumption that until there is a general agreement about the nature of African philosophy itself, African feminist philosophy will remain impoverished. The prompt for this interrogation is that while I disagree with aspects of Olawele's claim, there seems to be an evident dearth of African feminist philosophy. While there are numerous voices in African feminist socio-historical disciplines, there is almost nothing when it comes, in Olawele's words, to philosophy proper. Indeed, in searching for texts to prescribe to students on African feminist philosophy, the only meaningful piece I could find was Olawele's, explaining why there were none. Her central reason, as mentioned, is that as long as African philosophy itself remains a contested site, attempting to generate a viable African feminist philosophical position cannot emerge. Just for context, Sophie Olawele was the first woman in Nigeria to receive a PhD in philosophy in 1984 from the University of Ibadan, which is where you are, Maria. She was born in 1935 and died recently in 2018, and was an important figure in African philosophy, invested in revitalizing Yoruba philosophy. While the South African context is not the same, given apartheid, our first black female PhD in philosophy, my colleague Mpho Chivasa, received hers in 2018 from the University of Johannesburg. Though this is a very limited sample, it does suggest that professional black female African philosophers are particularly rare, whether they work on feminism or not. Olawele's argument is premised on the fact that the question of African philosophy itself is as yet unsettled. There are a number of influential competing positions on the nature of African philosophy, which Olawele surveys to demonstrate this sense of unsettledness. Firstly, negritude, promulgated by the likes of César and Senghor from the 1930s, which is characterized in intellectual opposition to Western thought and instead the affirmation of an authentic African consciousness and worldview. Secondly, ethnophilosophy, which is ethnological in character. This approach to African philosophy was established by Temples, a Franciscan missionary priest in the Congo, whose famous book, Bantu Philosophy, published in French in 1945, was an important contribution. In his book, he attempts to discern a unique axiomatic ontological principle identified as Ntu, which, like Logos in Western thought, underpins African thinking. I'm just going to get my water. Okay, so the first one is negritude, the second one is ethnology. The third, in reaction to ethnophilosophy, emerged in the 1950s, an affirmation of professional philosophy, implying the use of practices, methodologies, and procedures developed by Western philosophy within the African context. Thus, doing African philosophy in this sense is understood as writing and thinking about African concepts, problems, and theories, but drawing from Western and other philosophical traditions where appropriate. Hontonji and Weredu are two central and influential figures here. Lastly, there is the tradition known as sage philosophy, which is an exploration and defense of indigenous African philosophies that are oral in nature and expressed by African elders who are identified as the custodians of traditional wisdom. These may take the form of proverbs, myth, and folklore. An important proponent of this approach was Oruka.
So our next speakers are DeMarco and Tiffany Willoughby-Herard. DeMarco's at Wits in media studies. Tiffany is, in African American studies at UC Irvine, and the paper is Reflections on Processes, Method, and Feminist Positions, Still Here, Black Feminist Approaches to Cultural Studies in South Africa's 25 years since 1994.
Thank you everyone for being here. I wanted, and we both wanted actually, to open with a moment of silence for the many lives that have been lost here in the past week. It seems fitting and a way to invite those ancestors in and to acknowledge that the ways that they left here are not the ways that our best and most divine and sacred human selves would have intended for them, but they left the ways that they did, and we remember them still. So if you'll join us. Thank you all so much for that. So one of the things we're gonna talk about lots of different things about the process of publishing an anthology, and it's sort of like getting into the weeds of the sausage-making practice of publishing and what it actually looks like, because we all know there's a big difference between having a set of questions or talking to people or trying to document what a formation has been thinking about and actually seeing something come to print. And that difference makes a big difference in our livelihoods and what the future looks like for us and what the possibilities for being able to feed ourselves and feed our families are. And when I look back at most of my work, I find that a whole bunch of what I've been paying attention to in my own work has been what I call the material conditions of knowledge production. So not just which set of philosophies we're wrestling with, but what is the real work that we don't talk about before the thing and after the thing gets published, but that somebody does. So I'm going to open with just a few kind of prefatory remarks, and then we'll go into the formal presentation. So in this collection, Still Here, Studies of Culture in South Africa's 25 years since 1994, we're taking up a set of seemingly old questions about power. In order to inaugurate a new society and a new moment, there is a typical kind of account of post-emancipation societies, post-racial democracy societies, that everything in the old is gone. And now we're in this new place and everything is all good, simply because historians and propagandists for the state need us to be able to do that. Somehow we can all agree and move on. And yet we're living with the legacies of things that won't allow us to move on, that don't just haunt us, but that actually constrain our concepts and constrain what we think we can do. So when this project first began back in 2014, it was a research question about the 20 years since 1994. It has since evolved into a research question about culture and the ways that African feminisms, Black feminisms, and women of color feminisms inform the study of culture. And why? I'm a political theorist and a political scientist, so by all accounts, the way that I should be studying anything about the period since 1994 is that I should be focused on survey data. I should be looking at public opinion studies. I should see which government policies have passed and whether or not they've been operationalized. And yet what I've actually found since trying to do this work is that the study of culture, because it has a grasp on the ontological totality of people's lives and forces you to be in situ, actually helps you understand more about whether or not something like democracy actually exists, or whether it's just a set of pronouncements that the state needs us to be in agreement around. So the kind of cultural work that we look at in this text, that includes visual work, it includes comedy, it includes writing, it includes film and other forms of media. It's of proper concern for people like me who are political theorists, and people who believe that the transformation of society is largely an internal affair. The practice of feminist art making is absolutely essential to knowing how the ontological totality of change in this society and the world actually is operating. So what were some of the things that went along with our processes? So we first started out with something that was a contract for a special issue for a journal. It was meant to be a second part of a first series. So the first one went out without a hitch and went off. Then the second one was produced, and all of our authors submitted, and then the publisher ghosted us. You know that term? No?
For like 2 years they ghosted us.
Just for years. Just like we've submitted, hello, our lives are hanging in the balance, there are transitions happening. And this is something that happens quite often, actually, in higher ed academic publishing. So behind all of that process, we still had to wait and wade into the seemingly treacherous terrain of things like working across rank and status, sharing tiny windows of access. So what I brought to the table was the publishing relationship, because I had worked as the editor on the first collection, right? Sharing tiny windows of access, like access to research assistants. So because I was in a tenure track job before Dee was, one of our authors was working at a job with NRF and wasn't in the classroom. So wasn't doing full-time research. So they had submitted a piece to us and then didn't have time to respond to the reviewers, the anonymous reviewers' requests of things to change. So I lent to that scholar my research assistant all the way in Irvine, and they met online to try to help her get moving further on the revisions. Other parts of the kind of background part of our process was really allowing myself as a reviewer of these scholars' work to really become utterly obsessed with what I was learning from each of them. And the central problematic that the artists and art critics in this collection were sharing with us was that each time they produced art criticism on work that was focused on women of color, that was focused on Black women, that was focused on the issues of power and the dynamics of violence in this society, the critics and responses that they got were roundly horrific. The kinds of responses that they got from in public typically were very nasty, very dismissive, and very cold. And it wasn't that they really were engaging them on the substance of their work. They were engaging them on why are you still navigating and navel-gazing about what's happening to Black women? Why do you care? Why do you think this should be a generative area for research? Why do you think this matters? And because of our own political and philosophical commitments, it mattered just by dint of the work that they were doing. Some of the things that were part of our processes was this very scholar, who shall remain unnamed because the person is still a good friend of mine, after us waiting on the revisions on her particular chapter, then pulled the piece and then published with the same publisher that we were going to be publishing with. You have to laugh about these things because other people's careers are hanging in the balance, right? That's what I mean by the material conditions of knowledge production. But as I was saying to Dee, I would not have had an academic career if it had not been for other scholars who made a path in higher education talking about decolonization almost 20 years ago in South Africa. People who stood up for me when I had no provenance, I had no big name or anything like that. And so part of our work together has been insisting that publishing the scholarship on Black women, on women of color, is a political project in and of itself. It is a political project. So we've had to cultivate solidarity, which means for us moving in a direction together while being patient and unperturbed as each individual contributor goes through their own life processes. It would have been very easy to get mad and write off somebody, right? But we don't do that because we're part of an intellectual community. We don't do that. We don't do that. So maybe you'll go ahead and switch now to the other pieces. Yeah. This is a lovely thing that I found online, and it's some notes from an exhibition on the Beatles about the nature of art, just about the nature of art as protest, as world making, as world breaking, as world destroying, what art can do, and how much it sustains us.
Okay, so one of the things, well, I suppose one of the other challenges that in kind of as an overall was stuff around language and positionality. So before we went with Still Here, the current title of the book, we had Ukusinda, and so we wanted to kind of interpret the idea of Still Here. And so we had to kind of play around with what that meant for us, not speaking certain languages that are housed here, African languages of this country, what it meant for us to impose some of that in a title, but also to have that in the meaning of the book. And in the end, we actually just had to make a call to use the language that we use with each other. So we just had to go with English, and whether it carries the same weight or not, in some ways what we're saying is it's actually not even possible for us to know that. You know, we in some ways would have imposed our own idea of Still Here. And so, you know, so there were those kinds of challenges as well. And just around positionality, which I think Tiffany's touched on, stuff around do we use the language of Black feminism? Do we use the language of women of color? What are the intersections, and how do those things make sense to us in a compilation of work about this country, but also work that we know resonates, you know, across kind of other diaspora communities. So the work is bigger than just so we hope and intend.
Can I add something else about Ukusinda?
Yes, sure.
So, I mean, we went from, and we consulted with our contributors about this title.
Yeah.
So, Ukusinda was a word that was given to us by one of the contributors.
The one who pulled out.
The one who pulled out.
The one who pulled out.
And it came from interviews conducted where someone had spoken about their experience on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. Yes. And they said that the pain that they experienced in their community, and then being asked to come in public and talk about their life, it left them with a lingering hollow feeling that they said was Ukusinda. And so that seemed like an appropriate title. So then we went to some of our linguist friends, and they said, no, it doesn't mean that thing at all. Yeah. They said, try Sasinda and Siselapa, right? And they themselves, right, we have these kind of presumptions that because we are from here, and we might even speak more than one language, that we have the inner meaning of the language for every other person, but we don't, actually. We don't. And the funny thing with using the language that we speak to each other in, right, which is the muddled English that we share, right, is that it allowed us to convey what it means for the trauma to still be here, for this thing that's unresolved and perhaps irresolvable to still be here, but that we are still here. Not just as broken, but as people that have the capacity to document our own lives and our own struggles in a different way. So the success story is the book is coming out. Right? The success story is that the book has the temerity to be Black feminism in the title and yet have a woman of Indian descent on the cover. and say, because we remember the 1980s and we remember what it meant to be black, and we claim this other, deeper history that as the planet is burning and raging, we have to belong to each other and claim each other in a political way, in a political, ethical solidarity way.
Okay, so we have a few slides, and I'm wondering if, because of time, whether we don't just play the clip. I'll briefly go through some of the questions. The essays in the book kind of cover some of these questions. And the last sentence here is, we believe the work of race and gender justice is an endlessly generative area for art practice. And I think some of what Tiffany's been saying kind of resonates in this sentence. But just to go through some of the questions very briefly. So why are black women artists, visual and literary, still being viewed by major critics as contributing little or very little, right? So why is that still such a big part of the work that we are doing? Why are films and novels about the apartheid era still prioritizing white loss, right? And trying to hail white-only audiences? So there's a lot of that going on in the adaptations that we're seeing at the moment. And I mean, there's a lot we can say about that. The adaptations from novels to film, I mean. Why have black women culture workers been suppressed as thinkers and scholars? Feel free to jump in if you want to add anything. Yeah. How have contemporary African artists navigated the consumerism of the art world, for example, which a couple of our contributors speak about quite specifically? And, you know, notions like rejected as being kitsch, the work is kitsch, and also commenting on ethical imaginaries. What ways can laughter and comedy be more effective for developing fellow feeling and courage rather than collective expressions of spectacular anguish and hurt? So the essays that are part of this compilation cover some of these broad ideas and thoughts. Yeah. So, I mean, and again, I think, Tiffany, you've touched on this. We very much preface this question of what constitutes the cultural terrain of 20 plus years on, right? And like Tiffany said, when the project started, it was 20 years on, and we've had to amend and change almost in some ways as a parallel project to this kind of nationalist rainbow project, you know, and the commemoration of it. So every year for us has been a very kind of strange reprocessing of 1994 in its own ways in this packaging, right? And so we take up the Fanonian charge we need to make new discoveries while also being wise to old wine in new bottles. I don't know if there's anything you want to add before. Oh, this is the June, the June Jordan poem.
Sure.
Do you want to say something about it before?
You know, some of the other contributors that were included were folks who were writing about life across generations. So we included analysis of some poetry by Natalia Molabazzi, and she talks about one poem that's written to her grandmother and one poem that's written to her child. And in some ways, it's a kind of real illustration of the straddling and bridging work that we're trying to do with this project. Some of you will remember this poem by June Jordan, and it alludes to some of the things that Patricia McFadden was talking about in our opening talk. This is from a poem about my rights, and probably the most important lines are the very end, where June Jordan wrote, "I am not wrong, wrong is not my name is my own, my own, my own. And I can't tell you who the hell set things up like this, but I can tell you that from now on, my resistance, my simple and daily and nightly self-determination may very well cost you your life." I think one of the things about my own practice and life in publishing has been an understanding that even at the moments when things look the most vulnerable, it is actually the ethical, political commitments and the relationships that we build with each other that make us the most powerful. That make us the most powerful. this thing has held us together and enabled us to have a friendship. It's enabled me to be like just completely inside the world of these other scholars and to experience relief and dynamic visions of the world possible just by them telling stories about how they fought back and how they refused to just be forgotten as artists, how they refused to be forgotten as critics of the culture that they live in. We wanted to share something very kind of fun with you to close. This is what the cover.
Yeah.
So this is Charlene Kahn's work.
Okay, I'm gonna go out. Let me just do this quickly.
Grammarly does more than catch errors. With Grammarly, you can find really good. Start again.
You all remember this from The Matrix.
These are our husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, our children. Let us remember those that have been lost. Let us give thanks for those that have been found and who stand here beside us. Now I would like someone else to close this prayer. Someone who hasn't spoken here in a long time, but who I believe has something to say that we all need to hear. I give you more.
So here is this old text, long before we started working on this thing. I told a friend of mine before I was coming here, I sent the cover, because all I have is the cover, and I've been sending it to people. We have this wonderful book coming out. And my friend said, oh, Morpheus, still here, and sent me this. I had never even seen this thing. But it was such a rousing kind of reminder, I know we can't live on symbolism. I know that. And yet, sometimes it's what we have. Yeah, so we leave that.
Thank you so much, Tiffany and Dee, for reminding us that epistemes are not, they don't move around in disembodied ways. They're located within people, they emerge within material conditions and within social relations. within social relations, and they're messy and entangled, and they are always emergent, and we still end up being here, despite the attempt to erase us. Okay, so I'm going to open for questions. Shall we take a round of three, and then Joy? Thank you.
My first one is to Dominic. I want to be honest to say that I'm an engaged scholar. I don't talk about what I don't know. I want to contest the fact that kinship authority is seniority, not gender, in the Yoruba culture, according to Oyerunke Uyewumi. I want you to find a way to contest that, because you have already said, Simone de Beauvoir in her book, the woman is considered inferior to the man. That's even in the Western context. Not to talk of us who have lived hegemony. We feel it. I worked in a Nigerian university for 10 years. I left Obafemi because of hegemony and patriarchy. We come from a culture where we don't have a voice. We fight as women to have a voice. Now, I wanted to it's strange. I don't want to say it's strange. It's interesting to see someone from that background who says kinship authority says seniority, not gender. Because even the proverb of Yoruba, 80% of our proverb condemns women. One of them is Owa Eniyo, Lobiri Jebali, I will explain. There is no human being. That's why the woman is made a king. You see that Eniyo is human being. There is no human being. That's why a woman can be made a king. So we are from a very tough hegemony and patriarchal society, and it's known all over the world. So it would be nice to say that her book, The Invention of Women, speaking in the context, she's from the royal background. I am not. Nobody knows me for all I care. You see what I mean? So it's nice to go into details to say, no, this is not applicable in all settings. And you could read Kolawole 2004, 1997, those women, it's a fight. That's all I wanted you in a bit of clarity. Because leaving a university where I worked for 10 years because I was holding too much administrative positions, I said, no, you give me my PhD. No money, no funding. And that's how I came. So that's a bit of clarity. And that takes us back to Maria Martin about the myth of Oshun. Just a bit of clarification. I like that myth, and I want to say well done that you are developing a theory, but a bit of clarification about that myth. That myth is in line with what you said. The myth is that you have 17 gods who were sent, and one of them was a woman. The woman was kicked away. The men felt she was not important. And then she had the power of life, she had the power to create destinies. And so there was problem in the land, they had to go back to Orisha. Why? Because she was neglected. Why? She talked about mutual cooperation. The woman, you are not supposed to be part of us. So she held the power, the rain not to fall. So there was problem. That was when the men said, oh, now you are important. We need you after the fight. So you need to be able to clarify the importance of that cooperation, because she was initially neglected. She had a wanted pregnancy, and in my culture, you have a wanted pregnancy, you just go. You are nothing. so that's where this cooperation, mutual stuff comes from, because of the relegation of the African woman. Just a bit of clarity. And thank you very much.
Are there other questions?
I'm Maria. Okay, so I was there when you presented the Legbism at the Institute of African Studies for the first time. I think that was this year. I just want you to maybe shed more light on the practicality of that, because yes, we know there's a sense of complementarity between men and women in the Yoruba context, but in recent times, how does that play out really in practical terms? Because there are still roles. There are still roles that are meant for men and for women, and those that are meant for women. And there are ways that these roles are defined, and there are limitations for women still, even though there is Legbism, even though we acknowledge that, okay, men and women are in the garden working together. If there's a snake, it doesn't matter who kills it. But most of the times, there are roles that are assigned specifically to women, and there's like this invisible barrier that you can't seem to break through. So I think it's important that we don't just think about, okay, the existence of complementarity, but the realities of it. and how women can really step up and break those barriers that are existing, because those barriers are existing. I think if you can.
You said that the students were uncomfortable. I'm not knowing exactly the term you used. Feminism as a lens or as a way of thinking or theoretically kind of positioning themselves. And I was wondering why. What were some of the discomfort? Was it? Yeah. Okay. So I'll just leave that as one. And then to ask, what are some of the things that they then come up with, and do you think that, not do you think, but was the feeling with the students, was it that feminism couldn't, because I mean there are also different kinds of feminisms, like you said, and different kinds of, you know, ways in which it plays out or can be theoretically positioned. So what were some of the ways in which they thought that such a large and many bodies of scholarship within feminism could not at all house some of their concerns in thinking about some of these ideas? Does that make sense? Sorry, I think it's a weird question.
Thank you for your presentation. Dominic, I just wanted to alert you that there's a Nigerian feminist scholar by the name of Bibi Bakari Yusuf who did a really stellar deconstruction of Oyerumi's work, and she basically argues that this notion of Yoruba society being very gender neutral in the language, but in terms of embodied experience, women are incredibly subjugated. So I just wanted to buttress what she said. Yeah, Bibi's work is stellar.
Practicality of it is in the fact that I'm developing a theory that is rooted in an African-centered gender theory, for one, and then for two, I've also asked myself this question about whether it can apply to today. I'm a historian, and this is the post-war.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to try and answer part of it, and then I'm going to let Tiffany also answer part of it, and I don't know which part who will do. But I suppose firstly to say I completely hear you on writing, thinking, trying to produce work from a place of terror. For a long time I thought as you get further along and you get the next degree and the next degree, at some point you don't feel like an imposter. But unfortunately, I'm learning year after year.
Learn to bluff better.
I don't even know about that. You sit there and you're completely in awe of the keynote and you go, that's incredible. Yeah, let me go back to thinking about my little small corner of the universe. Or, I don't know. For me personally, I think that there are a few things that are helpful. The one is I think that there are tribes. And I think figuring out, I think safe spaces is too far a stretch, because I don't think that these spaces are all safe. At any point, anyone can come at you. You've been thinking about it long and hard. You think you've dealt with it with a level of like caution and generosity, and in your speaking about the theory or the positioning, you think like, okay, cool, this is something I'm interested in presenting, and someone will go, no, it's not. So you never know, even in spaces that seem safe and kind and generative. But I do think that with time, one develops relationships, and I do also think that there's a level of openness that I think you need to allow yourself. Otherwise, you're arrested in the cul-de-sac that Patricia was speaking about this morning. In that kind of cul-de-sac of fear. It's just another cul-de-sac of fear. There are many of us, I think, you're scared. We come to these spaces and we think they're going to be good or useful or kind in some ways. In my experience, it has helped to look around a room and know, not even know some of the people know them, but know I've read that person's work and there's something I've gotten from that's enriched me. This relationship, like Tiffany has said, has been incredibly a huge growth learning for me. When Tiffany says, let's have a meeting, she says 6 p.m. your time, which is 9 a.m. in the morning for her. My practical condition, I have a 3-year-old, so 6, it's like it's popping off in my house. It's all going wrong. And we're also trying to then still, for me, that's part of the material conditions for in terms of when I have to then combine these two identities, one where I take off a hat when I leave here, but also we need to meet, so then I need to now straddle the hats. And I don't think that's a unique experience. I'm just bringing it because I think it matters, and I think it's real, and I think it's one of the terror places. You're not meant to present as a human. You're meant to present as someone who is able to stay up around the clock. So for me, some of the things that you're speaking about in terms of the material conditions, then there's just other really crazy stuff in terms of publishing and those processes which Tiffany pointed at or spoke a little bit about before. Many blockages, and also still then trying to find links that are generative, that make sense in the larger body of work, in the actual production of what you're trying to do. But I think for both of us, what is important is to do that and still be people. So to do that with a kind of awareness of self and of each other. I am going to swing this to you now because I could say much more, but we could also speak a bit after.
We have an advisor in common, an advisor who for a certain moment at Wits had a very prominent life, and then at another moment was trash. And the process of having the person who you look up to and who's trained you be destroyed publicly is a really old colonial process of disciplining people so you can shut off the reproduction of the next generations, right? So part of the reason why in my own practice I think across generations is not because I'm looking for nostalgia, it's because I'm looking to be reminded of the many different ways of descent and the things that people imagined that they weren't supposed to imagine in their time period. Like the place that 20 years ago, that scholar imagined us. He didn't know us, he didn't father us, but he imagined us. And even when I think about somebody like Oyewumi, who is one of my mentors also, I think about her being trained by Barbara Christian. And Barbara Christian was one of those black women. In the University of California system, there was an entire raft of black women that all died of cancer in the same 3-4 year period of time. Like, they dropped like flies. And Barbara Christian echoes what this sister was talking about in terms of being slayed by service and being asked to do all of these things and build programs and being killed by these jobs in higher education. And so when I think Oyewumi, I always think Barbara Christian, knowing that genealogy and that she doesn't have to account for the ontological totality, but she does exactly what you say. When she says, think about how it is that you know what you know. It means there's other questions to be asked. That's it. We don't have to agree with the findings. It's just the permission that she imagined you. She didn't imagine everyone, not everyone in even her own society, but she imagined you. And whatever part you can take from it, you eat the meat and you leave the bones. If you're not one of the, what did somebody say earlier, the precious vegans? What did Charlene say?
Oh, did she say?
She said something. The poor vegans. But you take the thing that's going to be nutrient for you. And then while you're here, you imagine somebody else, no matter what it costs you. And we have other people coming. So.
Dominic, do you want to answer the question quickly on epistemic authority? Or
No, I just thank you for the very kind words. Thank you. I appreciate what you said.
I'm dying to respond, but jump out of the thing, because that's my project. I'm haunted by that very question. And I think about that through the collapse of ontological imaginaries into Frankensteinian subjects which we allow to run around through our texts as if they are real in the world. And what we do is we erase, like epistemically, paradigmatically, what we do is we erase the historicities of particular kinds of subjects, universalized subjects, usually from the global north, and the subjects that are marked are subjects who are located in the global south. And so some subjects are allowed to transcend history and imagined as if they aren't located within history, whereas other genealogies require the work of showing where they come from. And it has profound effects on the questions we ask, the distracting questions we ask, because they are not our questions. They are not our questions because we cannot even begin to imagine the questions we need to ask with the toolkits we've inherited. So that confusion is productive. The terror is productive, and it has an epistemic effect. And my next project's on episteme, and I think about the effective burden of episteme. What is that burden? As someone who's trying to think with a tainted archive and step out of that archive to do work towards the kind of future we all want to be able to inhabit. It entails carrying a particular kind of affective burden that gives us this terror because it matters. It matters precisely because we are not disembodied people walking around in a world who do not know what the effects of careless thought does. Because we've inherited a lot of careless thought. Careless, useless, abstract thought.
Careless, useless, and abstract.
But and what it does is it maims, it debilitates, and it allows entire worlds to be erased, to be treated as negligible, disposable, and spaces within which you can transmute violence, epistemicide, and the multiple modes of violence into spaces that do not matter. So the terror is very important and useful because it tells you it matters. And that, I think, thank you very much.